Hey there, Bob from Oregon's Constant Gardener. Welcome to the OCGFAM show to you, my YouTube buddies. What's going on? Let me know in the comments. Speaking of the comments, we have had some really good comments last couple days that I have not yet answered yet, but I want you to know I'm working on those because there was some real good, serious questions in there. We're going to get to those. We're going to have shows about them. We're going to be serious about the comments. It's a Saturday show, rare Saturday show. Hopefully we want to make it a, take a little drink here. Some good stuff. Make it a more regular thing to do Saturday shows. There's not quite so much structure to it. And today is perfect because there is no structure to today. What it is Jake Cragen and I went out and talked to Will McClatchey, who is an ethnobotanist, which is, well, you'll see in the video. He's a scientific guy with some amazing insight. And we asked him some somewhat thoughtful questions, and he just talked, showed us around his garden. It was pretty cool. I think you're gonna like it if you give it a chance. Just you know, settle back, maybe have a little cocktail, and watch the show and see what you think of it. And maybe this will lead to a more extensive conversation or a more focused conversation with Will. And if not, it's just some good fun on a Saturday. I love you, and I'll talk to you after the video.
Moved in. So there used to be, when we moved in, I mean, nobody had lived here in 7 years. And where we're standing right now, there was just a narrow mowed path, blackberries, just wall to wall. That orchard that's down there, we couldn't see it.
Oh,
we didn't know it was there.
Oh,
the blackberries were so high. And then we saw fruit sticking out in one place. And so we went and rented a skid steer, and we just rammed it through all the blackberries. So I did all these steep slopes, and then Valerie drove it around down there, and she basically discovered the orchard just by plowing through and going, oh, there's a tree. and so, you know, we kind of worked that out. And there's one tree that's like smacked over that she kind of drove over, and I've tried to slowly, you know, ooch it back up. But yeah, this place was just a blackberry nightmare. And so the first year, pretty much all we did was kill blackberry, teasel, Scotch broom, and
I love Scotch broom.
You can have all of it you want. Anyway, we've been fighting invasive species and then encouraging natives. So native blackberries, when we found, or native raspberries, I mean, we've encouraged them. So there's actually a little patch of raspberries.
Native raspberries?
Yeah.
I don't know that I've ever seen one.
I can show them to you. They don't look as pretty as yours. And we've also found little patches of these guys.
Wild lupin?
Yeah. And so there's several places around down there where we've got a huge patch of lupin. And of course the next door property has, the state's been putting a ton of money into conservation of lupins.
Oh, really?
And we've got more lupins on this property than they do. Oh, so this is what I was going to say. Every time you graft something, you cut the tops off. These are the tops. So you take one stem and suddenly you've got two stems, and some of those will take root and go. And so the number of rootstock doesn't go down, it keeps going up.
And you just have to put it in water like this. I mean, have you ever...
I put some root tone in there.
Okay, you have.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So, and I should have paid more attention to them, but I haven't. Oh yeah, they're all formed. I mean, well, yeah, that's the real problem. It's just the genetic diversity of those is super low. So this is what's left. You know, we did have a planting bed that went all the way over there. So we put the greenhouse in, took out all those trees, planted a bunch of them down there, gave away a bunch, and then have been grafting onto them. So each one of these is a little experiment, you know. And so like this guy, graft didn't take. This one, it's kind of taking. This one's doing really good. You know, so you look at them and some of them the graft did really good. Here, this one's kind of delayed.
So mine are about, well, so mine are coming up to about here, so it's time to graft, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's up to you. So,
well, I like the way.
And then these guys, I got to tighten this up because see, look at those. See, so there's several that are basically hitting the top.
Flat top.
Yeah. But yeah, so I got a whole bunch of different experiments here, all grafting different varieties.
Cool.
So I've got a database with who everybody is. Let me keep track of that. But these are wild raspberries right here. So they just volunteered and start growing right here.
Really?
They're not quite ripe yet, but you can see they're going to be coming on real soon.
Yeah. That's not And they look delicious.
Yeah.
I don't know.
They will be pretty good. They're a little tart, but they're pretty
great
good.
though. Low glycemic index, really good for you.
That's right. Great flavor. So. Yeah. So we just haven't focused on the garden this year. Last year this was like up to here in tomatoes and stuff. And so this year I decided I'm gonna focus. So the peas and then these. You know, another thing we did when we moved in was we started spreading white clover seed all over the place because there wasn't any here. Yeah. And it was taken off and it started to seed itself.
I have a lot. I have 2 pounds of seed if you want it that I don't know what to do with.
Oh, I'll take it. So we've got I think 4 or 5 species here, and we've got 2 species of alfalfa, a bunch of other things. So this is an example. You know, one of the man farms. See, the tree is practically buried right here. But he can keep his head above the man.
When the tree is bigger, this can grow all around the base of the plant.
That's right. And so this is providing a chemical cloud around him of protection. This is what Monsanto doesn't want.
Right.
They don't want you to just use nature to do it. And so then we plant...
Which is exactly what you do.
That's right. So we plant
nature.
Other plant families around them, and we start to develop an ecosystem. I mean, two species is not really a functional ecosystem, and all of this is an artificial thing. It's not natural, but we can create a lot of the ecosystem services. So this tree starts to feel at home.
So, and you could do that. It doesn't have to be for a tree. You can do that with anything. I mean, which is some of the companion planting.
That's right.
You could actually
take. There's a whole bunch of different philosophies, and most of them, I don't like the terms because they mix some good science with a bunch of voodoo. And I guess
hard not to do.
Yeah, I guess I've got my own voodoo too. But
you have studied a lot more than a lot of people in the specific areas of your study and understand terminology and names and language, a language that is present for botany and ethnobotany and pharmaceutical, all sorts of things. Right. So you have a really specific language and understand that language. A lot of people, we have to create our own to add to it.
But that's not bad. I mean, when we're doing ethnobotanical studies, we're really learning from people that have either over their lifetime or over centuries, multiple lifetimes, have developed a vocabulary that makes sense where they are.
Yes.
So the closest popular thing to this whole kind of design I'm doing is permaculture. But I don't like the term permaculture because of the voodoo baggage.
Yeah.
But there is a fair amount of science in there as well, and it's good. And so I usually, that's the word I usually avoid, just for the record.
People do understand it though. I mean,
sure.
And it's part of our culture. I really like when we first met, you described, I think it was a biosphere? Is that a word? So or biome, a biome, creating a biome. So, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things is that we often will, in modern agriculture, plant just one kind of plant.
Right.
For days.
Right, and the biome that we kill at that point is not really this stuff. It's this stuff down here. See, this right now has 2 species in it, the apple and the mint. So the biome of this soil sucks. I mean, see these little guys?
Yep.
They're doing their job right there, eating detritus and digesting everything. It's super important. But this soil is going to be horrible. The microbial diversity in here is going to be a fraction of what it is out here, with the grass and the dandelions and everything. Because we've got plant diversity, and therefore we've got species diversity of the microbes too.
So do you have mapped out like a certain amount of plants that's you want this many kinds of plants underneath the base of every tree?
I have a starting sequence.
Okay, and will it? I mean, in a wild seed sort of.
That's exactly right.
Itself.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's kind of a fundamental feature of the type of system that I've learned. It's not anything I've invented. Is that it self-seeds, and as holes develop, these plants fill in as they need to fill in. And once you've got enough diversity in there, no one thing will take over. And at that point, the only thing that I manage is the canopy of the fruit tree. The rest of it does its own thing. Now I can harvest from it. So this mint is certainly harvestable. So with a small distiller, I can harvest and produce nice oils. Remember, we're focused on flavor.
Are there apex plants that control everything else below them?
So that's kind of a concept that made sense in ecology in the 60s, but it's mostly been ditched. Really? Now the word is still being used by people, even ecologists.
That's a word. I just thought I invented that.
Well, keystone is the term that they used to use, but it's the same thing as an apex. So it's a plant that is real pivotal and oftentimes regulates some aspect of the environment.
Through its exudates?
Yeah. So, for instance, this pine tree up here. We are at the edge of a pine forest. So there's lots of pine forest as you go up the valley back that way. There's none over here. You jump over a couple of valleys, and then it starts again, and you go down towards Roseburg. And when you go this way, there's a little patch up there on top of the hill. So this pine is alone, and he's not regulating his environment much. But if we were up where the pine forest is, his needles landing on the ground over tens and hundreds of years changes the pH pretty dramatically. And so that's an example of a plant that's often discussed as an apex or a keystone plant because of that environmental regulation. However, ecologists have moved away from that as they've realized that, that plant's contributing something and it is helping shape an environment that's favorable for itself. But you can remove it and most of what is there still.
So do you think that's fine. Geography or some sort of butterfly effect where something happened a million years ago and it's just built from there?
I don't know. I mean, it's nice to build models. I mean, I've learned how to build models and say, ooh, if we pull this out, then, or if we add this, then it's grand and glorious. But it doesn't seem to really work that way in nature. So working with a computer model or in the lab, you see something happen, but when you're out on the landscape, I mean, that's why I'm building these little experiments.
I got you.
Is I know what the hypothesis is of what will happen, but what actually plays out in the end is not always the same thing.
So planning good for a cantilevered structure, not so good for a forest.
Yeah, but I mean, a forest is a cantilevered structure, if you will. I mean, kind of.
But those experiments are really kind of useless when you have the actual playground out here where you can build a true experiment.
No, I don't think they're useless. I think it's really important that you go back and forth. But I mean, engineers do this too.
Sure.
They'll develop something, and then until you build it, you don't know if it'll really work.
Romanero's bridge.
Yeah, exactly. When that sucker starts swaying, then you go, oh, well, let's recalculate this. And so, and nature, through the process of evolution, has been building a lot of bridges that failed.
Sure.
I mean, most species that have ever existed are not here; they're extinct.
Yeah.
And so, we look around at the survivors of a long experiment, and it just goes on and on. And so all that I'm doing is just throwing my own hand into the experiment, but I'm not the experimenter, really.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, like you said, this right here, there's everything. Find a hole. Some seed's going to come along, find a hole, get planted there. So it's sort of like with the tree, with everything. There's something will fill the space.
Right. So when we moved here, there was no clover. But what we did was we came in, and so you see patches that are just grass. That's because we dug it. So we just sat out here, and so we kind of started over there. And at first, we would dig up the whatever we didn't want, dandelions, and then we would throw the clover seed in there, and then just rake it around. And you can see lots of clover up there where it's a little thicker. And then we got, and so we started planting clover in other places, and now there's clover all over the crazy place. Now, it's an invasive species, but it's an invasive species that's helping me because it's a nitrogen fixer, makes the soil better.
Right. And everything's an invasive species at some point. I mean, if we just go back through history.
Well, we're kind of
right. I mean,
you want an apex? We're the apex invasive species. That's us. Yeah.
So, do you think that amending soil with minerals that we get is less valuable than or less effective than just planting the plants you want to do? I mean, is amending soil fanciful in the theory of it, like using vitamins is for us, or?
Well, that's an interesting analogy. So, vitamins for us, if we were eating a decent diet, then we're probably getting all the vitamins we need. I take a multivitamin, but it's just covering my bets, and it's cheap. It's probably total crap.
Yeah, so I mean, on some level, is amending soil kind of that? I mean,
I think there's a psychological aspect for us, not for the plant. I don't think the plant psychology could care less, but but I mean, you do see plants grow. Now, the data is kind of all over the map, and that's kind of what I've looked for. Is okay, what's the actual data? And so that's why I'm trying to set up an experiment using your box of stuff. But I'm going to need some help.
And this is in an outdoor environment. If you were growing indoors, I mean, you don't have a full environment. You have to amend your soil.
Well, you basically have to. It depends. I mean, if you brought in good soil, you could do it. If you're just using water as your base, then obviously you got to amend it with something.
But soils run out in pots too. I mean, your plant grows,
Sure.
it eats everything, so you need to amend with something. And outside, because there are some places where a plant has put off exudates that have changed this. You go into some place and it's good. If you want something in a timely fashion, according to our needs, amending can be really good because it gets it to where we want. It's not just left to nature.
Right, exactly. So if you just look at what the hand of God's doing out here, it's amending itself.
But not the same in every area. Some places you can't grow carrots, some places you can't grow tomato.
That's right. But in a biosphere, I mean, let's think about this. Assume that we got to scale things up. Assume that this was a biosphere. This crazy mant right here is hogging all this space, but there's 100% of him here, and there's 0% of him over here where my wife's flowers are, right? And so,
but the roots are going under there. And
there's
chemicals going through.
But I mean, if we picked 100 yards over there, he's not affecting that.
No,
not much. I mean, there is an exponential declining curve that goes out to infinity of his impact. And you can develop that kind of curve around each of them, around the chives, and you just...
Infinity is a wonderful thing.
It's a wonderful thing. But the point is that at across the biome scale, you need the diversity in there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all the diversity everywhere. Now, as a gardener, you often want all the diversity everywhere, or you want this to be this, and this to be that, and that to be that. So I've got a row of allium because I found that they are good protectors
from slugs, not snails.
From slugs, yeah. I haven't had to. I've seen a couple of snails here, but I've hardly had to deal with them.
That's wonderful. I have too many.
But I see ginormous slugs, crawling around.
Yeah.
Big old long. I'm like, oh, look at that guy. Anyway, so back to your question about amendments.
Yeah.
The amendments are a substitute for a plant or a microbe that should have been there in the first place.
To create the soil where the magnesium.
Right. So
whatever.
if you're growing cannabis in a greenhouse, if you were really, really trying to be organic and natural and blah blah blah, pick your quote category, then you would have all these other plants there. So instead of providing an amendment that gives you bioavailable phosphorus, you would provide the microorganisms, you would provide the basic mineral that's there, and you would provide plants that all together they can digest this and make it bioavailable for the cannabis.
Right.
And you do that with every single thing that you want. And instead of having to, hose it down with some microbes periodically, you would basically have a culture in your soil or your liquid, whatever your medium is, that sustains those microbes all the time. And so you would basically, if you were creating this, you would add them once, and then that's it.
But I won't have any birds or arthropods or the sun or any of these sorts of things. I mean, I have an incomplete environment.
And yes, that's true. And what it tells me is that your organism, so if I come up and I, like that, this plant is having a reaction right now. It's going, whoa!
What happened?
Somebody's trying to eat me, and it starts releasing different chemicals.
Right.
It's got little vacuoles in there, and some of them burst open, and chemicals go out, and it causes all kinds of crazy things to happen. And this plant becomes more flavorful. So if a snail comes along and bites a little nibble out of it, and a little nibble, the whole plant responds and goes, whoa! What do we got to fight snails? And it starts trying to fight the snail. But it's sending out a chemical signal, and the tomato over there goes, oh, whoa, somebody's fighting a battle. And it starts changing its chemistry. And it's a ripple effect. And it's got a limited, because the signals only travel so far It's that exponential.
It diminishes as it goes out.
That's right.
In strength.
And so, maybe the tree way down there doesn't get the signal, and so it doesn't defend. But any organism in the network that gets hit with something, whether it's a physical injury or some attack, it could be a fungus, it could be a virus. Every plant that gets hit with something responds in some way.
Sure.
And either it successfully responds, or maybe it tells its neighbors of the same species, and they then can mount a defense.
Because they got ahead of the thing. He may die, but his buddies got ahead of it.
Right. I mean, our bodies do this all the time. I mean, all three of us right now are sharing viruses as we breathe. And some of those viruses could be dangerous to one of us. So I might give you a cold, but your body starts fighting it.
Right.
Most of the time, your body's successful. It's the rare time it's not successful. And so we are fighting constantly every day. And so chemical diversity, if you put us in a plastic bubble, the diversity of chemistry in our bodies plummets. So when you've got a monoculture of cannabis in a greenhouse, it's like a boy in a plastic bubble.
And that's how it's always been grown.
That's right. And so it has no reason to mount a defense. Because it's in a clean environment, and the cleaner you make the environment, the chemically less interesting it becomes.
So your flavor profiles go down, your quality goes down.
Right.
So boosting
now, I mean, it's real important to say I'm not a cannabis expert, but I know that this is the case with any plant. Any plant does this. It doesn't matter what plant it is. Plants are like people. I mean, if you put us in a cage with no interaction with anything else, we're gonna fade away. And the plant's the same way. It needs interaction with other things.
When we're growing things in greenhouses, growing cannabis like that and other things, we don't have often the biodiversity needed. So we don't have bugs coming in often because we're trying to control that so the populations don't get out of control.
Right.
So adding things with chitin and different stuff, there's different things that will stimulate hormones to the plant. Thinks it's getting attacked, those will, in a controlled environment, produce those effects. Also,
you should be able, I mean, it should be possible, and I don't know enough of the chemistry to know how to do this, but it should be possible to basically mimic any chemical signal you want and basically cause your plants to shift their chemistry in whatever direction you want. Now, you may also have to do physical damage to the plants to cause some kinds of reactions.
Well, there's pruning of leaves. I mean, you're taking off a bunch of leaves and causing certain kinds of stress or different things.
Right, and you know what happens when you prune.
Yeah.
I mean, the plant responds.
Yeah.
And so, and we often prune because we get a response that we want. Right. And so we prune in a certain way to get the response we want.
So how about in a situation where we have one of these dialed-in environments, a biome going on, and we've got all the plants necessary around, could added nutrients boost growth then in a fashion, or is it just going to, I mean, that could mess up the system, adding inputs that really shouldn't be there because they're going to have an effect and change something, or could you really possibly get more out of a garden if you did a little bit of input of nutrients into something that's already so healthy? Could it, is there a possibility, I wonder, of producing more fruits that's still of the same quality and the same caliber? Would it hurt a plant? Would your cell growth all of a sudden get too fast, more than the rate that it was at? Would that hinder it in some area? I mean, you've
got about 50 questions tied up in there.
There's a lot there. Well,
So, the simple answer is if you stick nutrients that are limiting in the plant, and I don't know any particular plant what's limiting, but there's always something limiting. Everything that happens in the known universe has a rate limiting step.
Okay.
And so if you provide what's needed to overcome that rate limiting step, you create a different rate limiting step, but hopefully it's at a higher rate, and everything goes faster. All processes go faster. So
and that's not better or worse. That's just faster.
It's just faster. So the whole universe functions on energy, and all of life basically functions on using energy to move against the slope of entropy. So life is
positive entropy.
That's right. Well, to me, positive entropy is becoming more dispersed. So it's a less energetic state.
Okay.
And so life basically uses energy to create complexity you know, in the case of chemical bonds and so forth. And so this plant is at a far higher level of anti-entropy. You know, it could go way down the slope when it dies, and that's true of any plant. And so, but it takes time for it to overcome that, and it takes resources to overcome it. And so, if you know what the limiting resources are, you can cause this organism to increase its rate.
So what exactly does that mean?
Well, I mean, the easiest thing that we think about is temperature. If you try to grow your plants at 35 degrees or at 65 degrees or at 95 degrees, you're going to get a different growth rate, right?
Yes.
And there's obviously a curve in between there somehow. And there's a maximum up there where suddenly, you know, you start hitting some different limiting factors. Enzymes are being broken down and so forth. And so the trick is to know where those optimization points are and then be able to create an environment that will maximize what can happen at that level.
So you can find that level, run your plants at that level, and keep that level.
Right. Now, another form of stressor is temperature change. So maintaining a constant temperature is another way of decreasing chemical diversity. So these are kind of competing. You see, it was just like we were talking about this simple notion that you can make a plant really grow lots of vegetation, or you can make it grow reproductively.
Right.
You good? You going inside? Okay. Okay, I'll take them down. We're almost done.
So, you know, this is for people that grow cannabis.
Yeah, I gotta stand up.
Yeah, neat. You know, I
Getting old.
for years had my system running within a 10 or 5 degree variance in my room for temperature because I didn't want mildew.
Right.
And you know, there's always the thing about indoor versus outdoor. People like this for that reason, that for that reason. I personally have always indoor's fantastic, and I love the way that it is. But outdoor has flavors that you cannot reproduce.
Right. And so you're seeing that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's been huge for years, and
Right.
it's an interesting. There are people on both sides of the fence, and there's been conversation for years about it. And what you like is what you like. Everybody's got their thing.
You know, there's an interesting question or argument, which is, you know, if we focused all that we do on flavor and quality, so rather than saying flavor, it's probably better to say quality. So if we focused on quality rather than quantity, would we be able to produce enough food to feed our current population? And so you get people who are in favor of the whole thing saying, oh yeah, there's not a problem, we can do this, you know, and here's these models, and you know, once again it's this, here's the hypothesis, and we're going from kind of these knowns towards this possibility. But the simple reality is that we're kind of able to feed everybody. It's just not well distributed.
It's other issues. It's not about the amount of growing.
But if as a society gets more wealthy, they reproduce less.
Hopefully.
For the most part,
the UN statistic
Yeah.
that correlates best with decreased population is education of women. So us men, we're a bunch of dumbasses. It doesn't matter whether we get educated or not. The higher the average level of education of women, the lower the birth rate in any country. And there's some really cool data out there available on this that says this is the factor. So
That's not looking good for us, you know. We're men.
well, we're men, and we're in a country that I think the quality of the education is plummeting. People will believe almost anything now. They'll believe this video. What's that all about?
So, do you think that increased communication, which we certainly have, which was valuable when we were cavemen, that's how we outpaced the Neanderthals probably, is because we were able to communicate complex instructions to each other?
I don't know enough about the Neanderthals to know that. But.
We don't. No one does. But the idea that our ability to talk in complicated fashions of not just, it's over there, made us win, possibly.
Sure.
But that communication has gotten to an amazing point to where you can talk to almost anyone. right now.
Well, I can't talk to Noam Chomsky, who kind of is a proponent of what you're talking about, because his vocabulary is just beyond mine in freakish ways. But, I can talk to you because you and I have more or less the same vocabulary, I think. So, yeah, you're right. So is communication important? Yeah.
I guess what I was getting at is if the quality of the food increases to where we don't have to eat as much quantity.
Right.
I mean, the hunter-gatherers ate what they came across.
Right.
They couldn't have been coming across too much food, I wouldn't think, but they did fine. And we know when we go for, if you see people fasting, that perhaps that having a quality of food would lead to it being...
Well, so I guess... The answer, with hunter-gatherers, we've still got a few hunter-gatherer groups around the world that have been studied, and the problem is that these guys are kind of living in pretty marginal environments.
Okay.
Whereas if the whole world was hunter-gatherers, most people wouldn't be living in marginal environments.
Okay.
And the point of it all is that these guys are surviving reasonably well in marginal environments, which tells me that the skills that they had and probably their relatives had in the better environments, they would have been surviving just fine.
Sure.
So, but there's a population density question there too.
Yeah.
They live pretty thin on the ground.
But they also ate each other, possibly too, in like balanced out population.
Well, I don't know about that.
They conserve tremendous amounts of energy.
Right. There's, I don't know what the birth rate was like. There's some speculation. But my hunch is that the infant mortality rate was a lot
Pretty
higher.
Well, it was really high for us not too long ago.
Not too long ago.
You see that the average lifespan was 40 years. It wasn't. It was either 1 year or 70 years. It was largely the same.
Yeah.
Although with better food, and actually not all the issues that we have today with food, maybe the human brain, maybe the body might develop differently too. There might be fewer people surviving through that, but maybe the ones that did would actually survive better and have different functions.
Well, we know that the people who survived that were calorie scavengers. I mean, here I am, evolutionary evidence of this. Ancestors who could scavenge calories survived, and the ones who didn't, oh yeah, they're not with us. Their descendants didn't make it. Yeah. So there's propensity in a lot of descendant populations to get fat. Now we're at a time where we're calorie rich. We probably used to be, if you believe a lot of these models, we used to be protein and fat rich because we were good at kind of scavenging those things. And now we're just rich in carbohydrates.
Do you suppose
slamming down Twinkies?
That our bodies may adapt to that, to a way where we are able to use that excess energy productively?
So the measured rate of evolutionary change in humans is about one successful adaptation per 10,000 years. So
we will.
It's totally possible. But is it going to be the adaptation in the next 10,000 years? Maybe. Maybe it'll happen in 100,000 years. I don't know. But in the meanwhile,
sometimes though we have these magical leaps, right, where all of a sudden you get a bunch of things happening at once. Just likely not to happen now.
Intellectually, but not.
Well, yeah. So there's a difference between punctuated equilibrium of the mind, which we've got that going on in spades, and punctuated equilibrium happening on an evolutionary scale. Okay. Our population is frankly too big to see that kind of phenomena, I think. Now, it could happen in a subset that becomes isolated, because that kind of punctuation happens in a small group where suddenly you have an adaptation and they are able to use that successfully in their environment
through interbreeding, because they're not
right.
the diversity slows down the change, is what you're saying.
Right. So you get people who adapt to Twinkies. It's suddenly a useful food instead of total crap. And
I'll bet you don't eat Twinkies.
No, I don't eat Twinkies. My wife does. So this is one of our little arguments. I have my own junk. So anyway, whatever the target is, they suddenly they can just sit there and spoon raw sugar in, and they're rocking and rolling, and it doesn't have a detriment on their body. So some adaptation happens. I don't know what that would be, but if they are able to then propagate themselves, and it has to have it has to have an adaptation.
Right.
So does it allow them, and most of biology is about breeding, so does it allow them to have more successful progeny? I can't quite see how that would be, since our society has,
as humans, we are not being as regulated as much by evolution as our ancestors were. I mean,
True.
we wear glasses. We've got all kinds. All three of us have boots on. We got all kinds of things that are just wiping out, millions of years of motion in a certain direction.
A pair of shoes is 100,000 years of foot development.
Right.
But there are
right.
creatures that are now
A
living
bicycle.
on us that we didn't have back then.
That's
maybe.
right.
So
That's
if we're
right.
talking about
Body lice
creatures,
evolved with clothing.
I mean, there's bacteria and things now.
Oh,
If we step away from the human aspect, there's more and more humans for bacteria to eat and things to happen. Maybe we shouldn't talk about humans for a second. Something else is evolving, and we're like a host for this thing.
Well, certainly.
Maybe that's what it is. We're shoveling in sugar, and we evolve as a better host for the creature that's really in control.
Right. So I don't know that anybody's in control there, but I do know that generation times matter. And so in 100 human generations, you might get a little itty bitty drift in some direction on some trait.
Special powers, another toe.
Right. You're suddenly Magneto. No, maybe not. But the number of, over 100 human generations, I don't know how many trillions of generations you have of bacteria or viruses, but you can drift huge distances, huge. So, in your lifetime, the organisms in you are selecting and becoming better and better and better adapted to you. And this is part of what's tied up in, there's this question as to, well, why don't individuals just live forever? And one of the answers, or one of the hypotheses, is that, well, maybe this is a way of escaping all of your parasite load.
Interesting.
And
Why aren't parasites getting better and better at odds with entropy?
of course, but we all are. You and I are at odds with entropy. So, but that's what life's about.
Sure.
Life is constantly pushing against decay.
But they have an advantage because of their shorter lifespan.
Well, they have an advantage that so you got several different kinds of microorganisms. So if they're a eukaryote, so they breed like we do, then boy, you get a lot of genetic recombination with each generation. And so if it's a short-lived short generation span, then wow, you get a lot of genetic change and diversity potentially. And so it means that some selection can happen and the population can go forward with very different.
And in a million years, we may not recognize them as the species from back there that they came from. They may be an entirely different thing.
In 20 years, we may not. It doesn't even take a million. For them, if they've got short generation times. In a prokaryote, where you're just basically clonally dividing, it's just like with your plants. I mean, you're cloning cannabis. How often do you find a mutant that you go, oh, hey, this one's a little different? How often?
Not that often. People talk about it a lot more than I've seen.
And there's ways
personally.
that you can use certain
viruses,
chemicals to make it happen.
Different things will come in.
That's right.
That affect each one.
That's right.
And then change it. But
So there's ways that get that to happen, but just letting it happen, it's not very common.
right.
So all the apple diversity I've got here, maybe 60 to 100 varieties of apples and several species. Those varieties are a person going, hey, that branch is a little different than the rest of the tree. Something happened, and cutting it off and growing it. And then going, hey, the fruit's a little different, and giving it a name. And doing that over thousands of years, you get lots of diversity. So you can kind of see what the rate is by saying, if there's somewhere between 4,000 and 16,000, depending on who you believe, I think it's closer to the lower number, of apple varieties, and humans have been messing with apples for 10,000, 15,000 years maybe. And there's a little bit of crossbreeding in there, so that's helpful. But most of this has been selection either of sports or of seeds, where the genetic mix-up happened. Then that's kind of your rate. So let's say it's 15,000 years and we've got 15,000 varieties. So we're getting one variety a year across that whole time.
Plants more stable than animals? Look at dogs, how we've bred the crazy little short-legged dogs and
Right,
giant.
right, and Darwin, on Origin of Species, he used dogs as an example of what's possible, the genetic plasticity within this basically a wolf-like animal.
Sure. There was one wolf at some point.
Right, you came out with all this crazy diversity just by selecting in a certain direction. Oh, we want shorter noses or longer legs or whatever, and we want dogs that are little yippy things that drive us crazy.
In human scale, we can make the dog we're looking for.
Right. I mean, so there's science fiction writers that have written about doing that to us, and having us be as diverse as dogs are. So you got humans, that have specialized skills and talents, and maybe we're doing that. I mean, I don't think we're exactly breeding basketball players, but we do have, kind of.
It seems like people are taller than they used to be.
Right.
That could be nutrition.
It could be nutrition. Yeah. We may be coming right back to that question.
Yeah. Well,
they're eating more Twinkies and they get
question.
taller, more likely to be in the NBA.
Yep.
So there are things. You mentioned Darwin. Recently I learned about Lamarck.
Yeah.
I learned
Lamarck's an
about
interesting guy.
in the energy world for Reiki and for healing.
Yeah.
And how we can change, the possibility of things being able to change right now for a human body and for DNA to put out different cells that would be different. And supposedly that's been documented. There's a whole thing about the observer effect.
So you got to be real careful with Lamarck. He was a very smart guy, but he got one of his key elements wrong just because he was missing some important data. They didn't know anything about genetics. They really didn't know anything about genetics. And so when you throw genetics in and you compare Darwin and Lamarck, Darwin didn't know about genetics either. But what Darwin described more accurately is consistent with what happens with genetics. What Lamarck described most of the time is not consistent with genetics. However, Lamarck's ideas totally work with ideas. With what happens in our noggins. Yeah, you and I sharing information and it propagating across space and time. That's Lamarck's.
Which could have effect. I mean, so we're in an area where a lot of people discuss and have different thoughts and beliefs about these things.
Right. So Lamarck says, if I do push-ups every day and really, build myself up and don't be the wimp like I am, and then I have a child, so say I have a little boy or a little girl, that child, because I did push-ups, that child will grow up and have better muscles. And this is a core concept in Lamarckian thinking. Is that the parent can cause something to happen. There's a difference between selection of what's already there and the trait being passed on. So if I naturally, like my brother-in-law, just huge upper body, and I expect that his son is likely to have inherited some of that potential.
Yeah.
Now,
but not because he did the workout, but because it was genetically run through him.
Right. Now, there's a selection process that probably happened a long time ago that selected, maybe you can imagine a family that has several kids and one of them's kind of wimpy and one of them's really, muscly, and they live in an environment where if you're wimpy, you're dead.
Yeah.
And you're not going to reproduce. Then the stronger one's going to survive. I mean, that's kind of a very crude version, but
muscles aren't the only thing. You mentioned mind, so your mind can be a very powerful tool.
Sure.
There are many things that are powerful tools. What about things like gamma rays? So there are things that affect.
We're getting gamma rays right now, yeah.
But there are things that they do to seeds and plants to change what they become. So in a sense, that's something that might not be so Darwinian, because
it's completely Darwinian. So
it is. Because he still had these things coming in, and part of his whole thing of what
cause
and effect.
Yeah, so where does variation enter in? Where does variation come from ultimately? Well, the gamma rays are part of that mix. And so, all of these plants are getting plastered with gamma rays, and all of their cells have the potential to change. Now, most of their cells are not reproductive cells. So it's only when a cell that's in the lineage to become a reproductive cell, or the reproductive cell itself gets a change, that change can potentially go on. And at least the studies that I've read, most changes that you introduce are lethal. So most changes that happen don't make it. It's the same as most human pregnancies are actually spontaneously aborted. We don't even know that they were there. So the incidence of an egg and a sperm fertilizing is very high. But the incidence of that becoming a successful embryo is relatively low.
Well, there wasn't a soul available. There's no souls in the line today.
Well, if that's your philosophy, all right. I'm ready for
about
Lamarck to rule that puppy out.
So, real quick, just can you give us some background about yourself? Because that would be really nice for people watching
I started off as a successful union of a sperm and an egg. Very long time ago. Embedded in the wall. One cell became two. 16 cells. There's kind of a sort of imagination. Yes. Oh, yes.
Was that yesterday?
Okay. Yeah, I was born yesterday.
Well, okay, what about besides that?
Okay, well,
you know,
what,
people here,
I
know, and nobody wants to know
something about you.
Crap. I was born on the reservation outside of Yakima, and my father worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a forester. My mother was a history teacher, an English teacher, and not long after I was born, we moved to Arizona to a different reservation, White Mountain Apache, and we lived there until I was like 11, and then we moved to just southwest of Corvallis, south of Philomath, out on a farm there. And my dad had cattle all my life. He doesn't now, but he did then. And so I grew up on a farm with my dad, knowing a lot about plants and me not caring about plants. So I worked for a couple different logging companies, mill, and then the economy went upside down sometime in the, I guess, when was that? Would have been in the early 80s. And so...
Savings and loan?
Well,
the first bank crisis, the second bank crisis, the third bank crisis.
It just seems to be a cycle that about every 8 to 10 years something goes upside down. Anyway, so in one of those, that happened, and I was suddenly out of a job. I was working for a company called Westside Forestry, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. So I thought, well, I'll go to college. So I started going to college and taking classes at Lynn Benton and then OSU, and I don't know how much you want.
We're curious about the interesting stuff.
Please.
Why were you interested in agriculture?
No,
forestry,
not at all.
or
No.
How did it find you?
Well, I'll tell you the story then. So, I was studying chemistry because I really like organic chemistry. I loved it in high school, so I went to college. I was studying this, but because there was a gap between me going to college and me graduating high school, I had a friend who had gone to high school. I went to Corvallis High School, and he was a little more than a year ahead of me in chemistry, and he was also studying organic chemistry. And so we get together every once in a while. And one point we're talking, and he was just going on and on about how physical chemistry, PChem, was killing him. And the whole time he's having this conversation, I'm thinking, wow, this guy is so much smarter than I am. What am I going to do when I hit this class? If he's struggling, I'm just going to die. And so, like the moron that I was, and probably still partially am, hopefully only partially, I got out OSU's catalog of all the degrees, and I just started going through, and the question I had in my mind was, which degree has lots of organic chemistry but no physical chemistry? This is my naive reasoning. So I'm just going through.
The seeds of genius. Laziness, right? Or just you feel like you couldn't do it. I know some people they wanted to do it. They had a career in mind, but they became overwhelmed by one aspect of it. Just like, I can't do it.
That's exactly
what you were coming up against.
And I hadn't even tried it yet. I mean, I've never taken physical chemistry. I've read through a book and gone, okay, I kind of understand it. And I love physics, so I probably would have done okay, but I had this fear in my head. So anyway, this was my reasoning. I went through every degree from A to Z. And then I kind of prioritized them. I made this list. I had about 6 degrees, and at the top of it was pharmacy. I never even thought about pharmacy.
Oh, wow.
Lots of organic chemistry, no physical chemistry. I was like, huh? So I went and I found an advisor in the pharmacy, or actually, I went and found an advisor in the pharmacy school. The guy's name was Dr. Parrott. Love that name. And I came in and I kind of told him the story I just told you, and he looked at me and he said, that is the most stupid reason I have ever heard for choosing a degree. And I said, so can I go for it? And he's like, you got to take an entrance exam. There's hundreds of people apply, and we only take 120 a year, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
What do I do? And so I did it. So I got into pharmacy school, and near the end of pharmacy school, of course, you got to start doing internships. And the whole time I'd planned on just being an organic chemist. And so I was working in a lab at the time. I was working in a natural
It's like a real
lab.
estate agent getting a legal degree.
Right. It's kind of there at the edge.
Yeah, it's just something to have it so you can do what you want to do.
Right. And so, but then I started, you got to get your license, you got to practice some pharmacy.
Sure.
And it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, wow.
And the piece I didn't say in there was when I started at OSU, I was in chemistry, and I took a nuclear chemistry class, and I absolutely loved it. It was really interesting.
Yeah.
And so then I took a nuclear physics class, and boy, I really loved it. And OSU has a nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
I don't know if
yeah,
you know that.
no, yeah.
And so I got a job working there. I was in the health physics unit.
Really?
And it was fun. I loved it.
Yeah.
And so I worked there until at some point. So when we worked, we had a necklace that had several different meters on it, and we had finger rings, and there were several badges hanging on the necklace, and a tube, a gamma tube. We were talking about gamma earlier. And so we would do our various tasks around there, and often we would go into a lab where they were doing an experiment. And our job was to check and make sure that nobody had spilled something all over the place. And suddenly, Chernobyl, run! Yeah. And so nothing like that ever happened. But one week I was working in this lab, and they had this cobalt source, and my job at that point was to make they wanted the source to have a pulsing beam. And so I made this little spindle. I'm pretty good at making things. And so there was a lathe there, and so I made this spindle out of lead. And basically it was just a sheet of lead and then a larger sheet of lead, and they each had a hole. And the one on the middle I'd put on a turntable. And so we put the source in the middle, and you turn the turntable on and adjust the rheostat to the speed you want, and that gives you
There's
a
a
pulsing
hole every
beam.
once in a while.
Yeah, so when the holes line up, you get a pulse.
Yeah.
And when they're not. At some point in the process of making that thing, there's a cobalt source in there. I got a lifetime dose on my hand. And right now I can't remember if it was left or right, but it was one hand. And the next week, and once a week our badges were all sent off to I don't know where to be checked.
And there you're done.
And I came in, and my boss was just looking at me laughing. He goes, his name is Dave Pratt. He says, well, he goes, look at this report. And I looked at it, and I go, well, what's that mean? He goes, it means you're done. I go, what do you mean? He goes, you can't work in this kind of thing anymore. You're done. I was like, oh, crap. So anyway, but despite that, it turned out that I could still do nuclear pharmacy. So I got certified in nuclear pharmacy. I haven't kept up with it, and it's really gone some cool places. But but I did that for a while too.
Wow.
So all of that happened, and so I had all these options. And then at some point, I was meeting with this old pharmacist, George Constantine, great guy, and I had started doing some graduate work at OSU in natural product chemistry, and I was working for a marine chemist, Bill Gerwick, and I had lunch with George one day, and he was asking, kind of how the work was going, and he goes, you're really interested in people, and you really like the pharmacy side. I goes, I don't know why you're stuck in a lab or, out diving for, stuff in the ocean. He goes, you ought to look into ethnobotany. I'm like, what's that? So he goes, well, there's this conference that I've been invited to, the First International Conference of Ethnopharmacology. He goes, it's an invite only. You can take my invitation and go.
Ground floor.
Yeah, so I was like, okay.
Yeah.
So Valerie and I went to Strasbourg, France, where the meeting was.
Oh my
It
goodness.
was the first time we'd been, outside North America, and it was just hugely eye-opening. And I met the guy who became my master's professor there, and just all sorts of things happened. I met a woman, Nina Etkin, who became hugely important in my career. And just all these things happened, and it was because George said, hey, So anyway, long story short, I went off, got a master's, and then I got a PhD, and then I started teaching at University of Hawaii, and I taught there for 16 years. And yeah, it gave me the opportunity to do research all over the place and travel
Wow.
around. So my early work was more natural product chemistry stuff, and that slowly evolved more into ethnobotany and more of kind of a social aspect than a botanical aspect. And then I shifted more and more into a conservation biology mode. And the last 5 years before I moved here, I was in Texas, head of a research institute. So I was the, what was it called? Associate Director for Research at the Botanical Research Institute of Texas.
This is like anthropology?
So there's pieces of anthropology in there. And I also have an anthropology degree. I didn't mention that. I got a pharmacy and anthropology degree in parallel. But the anthropology degree was
Coincidentally?
accidental. It's another story.
Yeah. No, let's stick with this story. So how is it anthropology?
So, well, I mean, it's anthropology, and so this crappy looking garden right here. I wish I had last year's garden because, man, my tomatoes were rocking.
Everyone says that.
Well, I've got certain things doing good this year, but
Yeah.
the peas down there look great.
It's always a mixed bag.
But I'm a
Anthropology.
I'm a tomato person. It is. Oh, squirrel. So the way what I do as anthropology is that I'm not just interested in plants. I'm interested in how humans interact with the plants. And so, if you're growing cannabis, you're interacting heavily with that plant, and you represent a long lineage of humans interacting with that plant.
Specifically.
Right.
To a point.
And
not by accident.
That's right. And there's massive social ramifications in there. I mean, there's legal things, there's religious things, there's all these things, and when you bundle them all together, it's anthropology.
Okay.
It's all culture. But that culture is focused on that plant. And so a big chunk of my career has been, so like when I did my graduate work, the master's work I did in a small Polynesian island in the South Pacific, and I was learning from traditional healers about the plants that they use. So I went there thinking I was going to be a botanist, but I ended up using the cultural side far more because, it's not this plant treats that disease.
Right.
It's you put all these things together and you come out with this sort of a thing. What?
Call it there.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna need to go help her do that.
Okay.
That's
Okay, that was fun. We sure appreciate Will doing that, and Jake Kraken taking us out there. I had a really nice time with Jake. After we left there, we went for a little drive, went up through Cresswell, went to a bakery, had a ham sandwich, and just had a real good time talking. Hopefully we can do more of this kind of thing in the future. Let me know what you thought of this in the comments. Anything going on for next week you want to talk about, let me know about that too. And then Monday we're going to start strong with this thing, get some stuff figured out. I love you, and I'll see you on Monday. For more information about anything on today's show, go to our website, OCGFAM.com. And if you buy anything while you're there, use the code OCGFAMShow. It's going to save you 20%, and it's a lot of fun. The OCGFAM Show, it's pretty good. It happens every day. It's the OCGFAM Show. See you on Monday.